Her hands no longer bent properly. The knuckles were hard as oak knots, and she had learned, after decades, to hold the spoon with both open palms the way a child learns to drink from a bowl. The fire had been out for 2 days. The winter of 1,347 inches. Lincolnshire asked no one's permission. She had oats. She had well water. She had a bundle of dried herbs hanging from the lowest beam of the ceiling, where rats passed every night before dawn. That was it. That was everything. And with that, she was going to eat. The medieval history we were taught is built around banquets, roasted boars, imported ceramics, Bordeaux wine spilled across tables, long enough to seat an army. That version isn't a lie. It simply omits 90% of the people who actually existed. It omits specifically the oldest, the loneliest, those who had already buried their husbands, their children, their neighbors, and still had to wake up every morning and solve the problem of not starving before nightfall. The elderly poor of medieval Europe, and here we're talking about anyone over 50 who had no family or guaranteed income, lived in a condition that documents of the era describe, without ceremony, as discreet mendicancy. They weren't beggars working the streets. They were people who had worked their entire lives, who knew every grain that grew within 10 kilometers around them, and who now needed to turn almost nothing into something that would sustain the body for one more day. That knowledge, that silent science of survival food, is what nearly vanished completely from historical memory. 25 meals, not feast recipes, not the cuisine of wealthy monasteries or manorial kitchens. The 25 ways that an old person, alone and with minimal resources, could eat, warm the body, trick hunger, and wake up the next day. The first and most fundamental was raw oat pottage. Don't confuse it with modern porridge. It was thicker, darker, and smelled of wet earth mixed with smoke. The oats soaked in cold water since the night before. Inside whatever container was available, a worn wooden bowl, a piece of stiffened leather folded into a basin, sometimes directly in a depression carved into the hearthstone. In the morning, the cloudy liquid that remained was heated with stones, pulled from the embers, and dropped into the vessel. No pot. No direct contact with fire. The heat of the stones cooked it slowly, and the result was a dense paste that stuck to the mouth, without salt, without flavor, beyond the mild bitterness of oats lightly fermented overnight. You ate it with your fingers or with a sliver of wood. You ate until you no longer felt the emptiness in your stomach, not because it was good, because it was there. The second was peel broth. Every vegetable that came into a poor person's hands, a turnip stolen from an already harvested field, a carrot bought for a piece of old cloth, an onion received in exchange for a day's work, was peeled with surgical care. And the peelings didn't go to waste. The peelings went into a clay pot with well water and simmered over a low fire until the water turned brown and fragrant. That liquid was the broth. Drunk hot, it warmed the chest in a way that only those who have truly been cold understand. Not like pleasure, but like immediate physical relief, like a pain that stops. The peelings themselves were sometimes eaten afterward, already completely soft and without nutrition, more for the texture in the mouth than for any real benefit. After peel broth, there is old bread sops, and here we need to talk about bread, because the medieval bread a poor elderly person ate bears no relation to bread today. It was a mixture of rye, barley, sometimes ground acorns when the winter had been bad, bran that wealthier mills discarded and that poorer people bought or simply gathered from the ground around the millstones. That bread went hard as stone within 2 days. Hard enough to crack a tooth, and cracking a tooth in the 14th century was a tragedy that could kill slowly through infection, through the inability to eat, through fever that wouldn't break. So the stale bread was placed in whatever warm liquid was available, water, peel broth, whey if there was any, and left there until soft enough to be swallowed with the gums. Sops was that. Bread softened in liquid, eaten slowly, patiently, because any haste caused choking. Nettle soup existed across all of Europe and was one of the few meals a person with absolutely no financial resources could make. Nettles grew everywhere, especially near places where there were human and animal droppings, that is, near where people lived. You picked them with your hands wrapped in cloth, or simply accepted the sting as part of the process. Boiled in water, nettles lost the toxin that burns and became similar in texture to heavily cooked spinach, deep green in color, with an earthy, slightly mineral flavor. A bowl of hot nettle soup, with salt if you had it, without salt if you didn't, was more nutritious than it sounds. Vitamin C, iron, residual protein. The body of an old person living on this learned to extract the maximum from every spoonful. Ground barley porridge was the medieval equivalent of what we call porridge today, but medieval barley was far less refined than any grain we find now. It had husks, it had hardness. It was ground in stone mills that left mineral fragments in the flour, and swallowing that for decades was one of the reasons why medieval teeth, when found in archaeological excavations, show catastrophic wear even in young people. Imagine the state of the teeth of someone 60 years old who had eaten coarsely ground barley 3 times a day since childhood. The porridge was cooked long and slow, stirred with a stick or a bone until thick enough that the spoon stood upright inside it. Eaten just like that, hot, in a vessel shared with the floor you slept on and the ceiling rotting above you. There is a group of medieval recipes that historians call desperate foods, not because the people were desperate in the emotional sense, but because they were resources activated when everything else had run out. Acorn flour was one of them. Oak acorns are bitter because of tannins. They are mildly toxic when raw, enough to cause severe intestinal discomfort. But people who knew the process understood that the acorns needed to be ground, the flour soaked in running water for hours, sometimes days, to wash out the tannins, and then dried and used to make something resembling bread. Acorn bread was dense, dark, with a slightly astringent flavor even after the washing process. But it sustained. And in a winter with nothing else, sustaining was enough to be precious. Bone broth was different from what we know today. There was no butcher discarding clean bones the way we do now. Every piece of animal was fully used before reaching poor hands. The bones a poor elderly person could obtain were already gnawed, already boiled once or twice by others, bought for nearly nothing in city markets, or given out of charity at convents. Those bones were boiled once more, for hours, until the liquid turned fatty and dense, and that broth was thickened with whatever flour was available, barley, oats, acorn, to create something that was, technically, a soup. The flavor was of old fat and smoke. But there were calories there, and calories were the most fundamental currency of all existence. There was also frumenti, which appears in medieval documents as festival food, but which, in its poorer versions, was simply whole wheat grains, boiled in water until they burst open, served without the milk, without the spices, without the sugar that appears in wealthier versions. Whole grains, boiled, chewed, slowly, swallowed. The stomach of a person who ate this every week was different from ours, better trained to extract nutrition from sources that our modern digestive system would simply discard. Old cheese. And when I say old, I mean something completely different from the aged cheese that is today. A delicacy was a frequent item in the diet of poor elderly people because it was what remained after the good cheese had been sold. The leftover whey, pressed and left to dry, became hard as chalk, with a strong smell that ranged from intense to simply unbearable for the unaccustomed. A sliver of this cheese rubbed on a bread crust was, in caloric and protein terms, a decent meal. The problem was that few could obtain it regularly. The dairy cattle belonged to someone, the milk belonged to someone, and the leftovers that reached the poorest hands arrived already as the final layer of a long chain of extraction. Fermented mustard leaves and salted water were another resource. Not the mustard we know, the green leaves of plants from the brassica family that grew on waste ground and field edges. Fermented for a few days in lightly salted water, they turned sour, pungent, with a slippery texture, eaten alone or mixed into softened bread. The sharpness of the mustard had an interesting effect. It tricked the brain into feeling it was eating something with strong flavor, something substantial, even when the actual substance was minimal. Sorrel porridge, wildwood sorrel, appears in records of the poor across medieval England. Sorrel has an intensely sour, almost citrusy flavor, and in large quantities is problematic for the kidneys because of oxalate. But in moderate doses, cooked in water with a little coarse flour, it was one of the few foods that could be made entirely from plants gathered freely in fields and riverbanks. The sourness also served as a psychological substitute for seasoning. When you have no salt, no spices, no fat, the acidity of sorrel makes the brain register something, not necessarily pleasure, but something. There is a practice documented in medieval English sources that historians call pot herbs broth. An old clay pot hung over embers that barely burned to save firewood, with water and a handful of the most common herbs growing near any dwelling: thyme, wild marjoram, bay leaves, dill, some rosemary. Boiled together, these herbs created an aromatic liquid that warmed the chest, aided digestion, and had the immense psychological effect of smelling like something good in an environment where almost everything smelled of mold, sweat, and decay. Smell is underestimated as a factor in psychological survival. A broth that smelled of herbs in a cold room was a sign that this person still had control over something, still made choices, still existed with some agency. Dredge porridge, popularly called mixed grain porridge, was made with whatever combination of grains was available at the same time. Oats, barley, rye, sometimes ground dried pea grains, all mixed together. Each grain cooks in a different time and has a different texture, so the result was inconsistent and frequently unpleasant. Some parts hard, some parts mushy, some parts that hadn't fully cooked. But it was what you had when you had leftovers of 5 different things and not enough of any single one to make a complete meal. Boiled parsnips deserve their own paragraph because they were, possibly, the most accessible food in medieval Europe before the arrival of the potato. The parsnip grew easily, was resistant to cold, became sweeter after the first frost, and could be cooked in dozens of ways. Simply boiled in water and mashed with the back of a wooden spoon, it had the texture of a puree and a sweet flavor that tricked the body into feeling it had eaten something substantial. For worn teeth, sensitive gums, an elderly throat that had difficulty with solid textures, parsnip puree was a gift. Sweet, soft, warm, easy to swallow. In the winter months, when the ground was frozen and there was little else to harvest, the parsnip stored in dry straw in a cool corner of the room could be the difference between eating and not eating. Dried pea soup was another pillar. Dried peas could be stored for months, sometimes years, and a small quantity went a long way when cooked in water long enough. The process was lengthy. Dried peas needed hours of cooking to soften and required firewood or peat, which also cost something. But the result was protein-rich, thick, and filling in a way that broths and grain gruels were not. A person who could maintain even a small stock of dried peas had a strategic nutritional reserve. They knew that no matter how bad the winter was, as long as the peas lasted, there was something to eat. Pea bread made with ground dried pea flour, mixed with whatever other grain was available, was denser, with a strange texture compared to wheat or barley bread, but more protein-rich. It had a grayish-green color before baking and turned brownish after, with the smell of a scorched legume that was sometimes pleasant and sometimes simply smelled of something old. Eaten with bone broth or simply soaked in hot salted water, it constituted a meal that a 60-year-old body could use to work. Dripping the fat left over from any meat that had been cooked, collected from the base of pots and vessels and stored with almost religious care, was spread on bread with a layer so thin it was barely visible. But fat fundamentally changes the experience of eating hard, flavorless bread. It gives texture. It gives calories. It makes the body recognize that it is receiving energy efficiently. The medieval obsession of the poor classes with fat in any form is no historical coincidence. It is survival logic. Fat was concentrated calories. Concentrated calories were more days of life. Fresh curd cheese, medieval cottage cheese, made directly from soured milk without any elaborate process, could sometimes be obtained as donations from convents or purchased cheaply when there was excess dairy production. Lightly salted, eaten with bread, it was the most palatable form of animal protein that most poor elderly people probably encountered with some regularity. Benedictine convents, particularly in England and France, kept records of food donations to the local poor, and curd cheese appears frequently enough to indicate it was a real item in these people's diets, not just a theoretical concept in Christian theology of charity. Toasted oats, oat grains, heated directly on hot stones until lightly charred on the outside, created something with the flavor of roasted nuts, more palatable than raw oats, and with the practical advantage of requiring neither water nor long cooking time. They could be eaten directly, chewed slowly, swallowed with whatever was available to drink. On journeys, in emergency situations, or simply on a day when the firewood had run out, toasted oats were the option that required nothing beyond the residual heat of stones warmed the night before. Fermented wheat water, a primitive version of what today would more closely resemble a drink than a food, was made by leaving wheat grains to soak for several days until fermentation began, then straining the liquid and drinking it, slightly alcoholic, slightly sour, smelling of bread beginning to rot in a controlled way. Not substantially nutritious, but it occupied the stomach with something warm and mildly intoxicating that helped with the chronic pain that any old person carried in the body. It is no exaggeration to suggest that the mild analgesic effect of residual alcohol in these fermented drinks was consciously sought by people living with arthritis, aching teeth, backs that years of physical labor had permanently bent. Ground mustard seeds made into a paste with cheap vinegar, a condiment present even in the poorest diets, because vinegar was a byproduct of wine production and was distributed widely, transformed any flavorless food into something that at least registered as real food in the mouth. Rubbed on old bread, mixed into bone broth, added to barley porridge, mustard was cheap enough to be present even in the most miserable kitchens. There is something almost poetic in this, that the one thing that didn't run out, even in the most extreme situations, was also the thing that most stimulated the palate. The stew of turnips and onions, vegetables that grew with little care, resisted the cold, stored well, and were so cheap that anyone could obtain them somehow, was probably the most repeated meal in the life of a poor medieval elderly person. Turnip cut into large chunks, onion whole or halved, boiled together in water until completely soft, eaten with the broth that remained. No garnish, no seasoning beyond salt, when there was any. The flavor was the sweet lightness of the turnips, the mild sharpness of the onions, and the texture was of something completely surrendered to heat, without resistance. Eaten directly from the cooking vessel, with hands or with a piece of bread, hard enough to push the larger pieces around. Dried fava bean paste was the medieval version of what we might today call hummus. Dried fava beans, boiled long enough to become paste, with a texture similar to wet clay, grayish-green in color, with an earthy, slightly bitter flavor. Mixed with whatever fat was available and salt, it was spread on bread or eaten with a spoon. Fava was probably the most widely cultivated legume in medieval Europe, before the changes brought by the Crusades and later trade, which means it was available in reasonable quantities even to people with little money. Beet leaf broth, not the root, which was expensive and considered quality food, but the green leaves, which farmers discarded or sold for almost nothing, were boiled until soft in lightly salted water. Beet leaves have an earthy, slightly metallic flavor, with a texture after cooking that resembles old leather. But they contained iron, vitamins, and in a body that had probably seen no meat for weeks or months, that kind of micronutrition made a difference in how the body functioned. Even if no one in the 14th century knew the word micronutrient. And then there was the last meal on the list. Not the last in importance, perhaps the most important of all, and certainly the most invisible in historical records. Call it aqua cocta cum pane in the Latin documents of monasteries. Call it sops in water in the English records. Or call it nothing at all, because no one named it, because no one considered it worthy of a name. Hot water with bread, just that. Water heated in any vessel, old bread softened inside until it disintegrated, forming a nearly transparent gruel with no flavor, no real color, no texture beyond warm and wet. It was what a person ate when everything else had truly run out. When the oats were gone, when the peas were gone, when there was no more turnip, no more peels, no more bones to boil, no more fat to scrape from any vessel. When there was only bread too hard to be eaten any other way, and water from the well. This meal, if we can call it a meal, appears in medieval charity records as the threshold, the point at which religious institutions were sought, the point at which a person admitted they were, in the language of the era, in need. But there is something those records don't capture, that only archaeology and bone analysis from medieval pauper cemeteries is beginning to suggest. Many of these people lived at that threshold for decades. Not as an emergency, as a way of life. The old human body, trained by deprivation, can extract nutrition from sources that modern physiology considers insufficient, not comfortably, not without pain, not without the kind of adaptation that leaves marks on bones, teeth, and joints. But it can. Today, when we throw out bread that is 2 days old, when we discard vegetable peelings, the outer leaves of vegetables, bones that yielded one broth and nothing more. When the oats in plastic packaging on the supermarket shelf represent one option among several dozen other products, perhaps it's worth pausing for a moment and recognizing that this knowledge we've been discussing is not historical curiosity. It is the bodily memory of a vast proportion of humanity that made it to today. By surviving those winters, preparing those broths, heating those stones, softening those breads. None of them left written recipes. None of them expected that anyone would one day find their methods interesting. They simply cooked what they had and woke up the next day. The woman from Lincolnshire with the hardened fingers. She has no name in the records. No document mentions her. But she existed, her kind of existence, existed in millions of copies, in every winter of the centuries that make up the Middle Ages, repeated until it simply seemed like the natural condition of poor old age. There is something in the residue of charred oats found in excavated medieval hearths in the north of England, in the traces of bone broth boiled to its limit on the walls of buried ceramics. That is a kind of signature, not of defeat, of stubborn persistence, of someone who knew exactly what they were doing with very little and who did it again one more time until they no longer needed to.